Hello, everybody. Greetings from Ankara, the capital of Turkey, to all our professors, scholars, and students who are watching us. Welcome to another episode of Orientalism webinar series, organized by the Social Sciences University of Ankara, Turkey, or ASBÜ, as we say it in Turkish. I am Beyaz Akman, Associate Professor of English Language and Literature. I'm also the Vice Dean of the Faculty of Foreign Languages, the only such faculty in Turkey designed specifically to study the languages and literatures of other cultures. Now, to give you a brief intro about our series, Orientalism webinar series is a series of online lectures, each of which hosts a world-famous distinguished speaker on a related field with Orientalism. In each webinar session, a speaker will give a 30-40-minute talk on a topic about their scholarship, followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. Now, during the talk, please send your questions to asbüoz@gmail.com. That is, again, the acronym of our university in Turkish and the initials of Orientalism webinar series. In this series, our aim is to give an opportunity to students and scholars from around the world to become familiar with the trailblazing and cutting-edge scholarship of internationally acclaimed academics on critical theories of Orientalism and postcolonialism. Related issues to be discussed include the image of the other, namely the East, Islam, and Turks in Western discourse, Islamophobia, cross-cultural interactions and encounters between East and West in the historical context of the Renaissance and beyond. With the gracious and generous contributions of these important scholars, we hope to inspire more emerging students and scholars to see the rich possibilities of potential research topics in this significant area of studies with necessary updates. Now, let me please introduce you the speaker of the week. Our distinguished speaker for this webinar is Halim Rane. Professor Halim Rane is an associate professor of Islamic Studies at Griffith University, a public research university in Brisbane, Australia. His teaching and research encompass the study of Islam-West relations, contemporary Islamic thought, religious and ideological extremism, and Muslim communities in Australia and the West. Professor Rane is the author of over 60 publications on Islamic and Muslim issues, including 6 books. Now, I would like to mention to you some of his works he wrote or co-wrote. Islam and Muslims in the West, Major Issues and Debates. This book analyzes the development of Islam and Muslim communities in the West, including influences from abroad, relations with the state and society, and internal community dynamics. It provides an overview of the major issues and debates that have arisen over the last 3 to 4 decades. Another book, Media Framing of the Muslim World, Conflicts, Crisis, and Context. Media Framing of the Muslim World examines and explains how news about Islam and the Muslim world is produced and consumed, and how it impacts on relations between Islam and the West. Making Australian Foreign Policy on Israel-Palestine. Based on extensive research of Australian media coverage, public opinion, interest groups, as well as in-depth interviews with current and former diplomats and politicians, this book provides a unique insight into the policymaking process in regards to one of the world's most enduring and volatile dilemmas. And finally, another one of Professor Rane's books is Islam and Contemporary Civilization. This book examines the most complex debates and dilemmas facing Islam today, both internally and its relations with Western civilization. Professor Rane is also the director of Griffith Center for Social and Cultural Research. He also served as the deputy head of school learning and teaching at Griffith University School of Humanities, Languages, and Social Science. In 2015, Halim Rane received the prestigious award of Australian University Teacher of the Year award. And from 2019 to 2021, he was the president of the Australian Association of Islamic and Muslim Studies. Now, students and scholars worldwide, without any further ado, it's my privilege to introduce you Halim Rane. Professor, welcome to Orientalism webinar series. I thank you so much. I thank you so much on behalf of our department, faculty, and the university for accepting our invitation to our series. That is so kind and generous of you. Now, the floor, well, I should say the screen is all yours. Let me just go ahead and pin you so that our viewers can see you. Please go ahead. The floor is all yours, Professor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bayezid. It's an absolute pleasure to be here on your webinar series, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about some of my research and some of these very important issues that we're going to discuss today. So three things I suppose I'll discuss today: international media, Islam, and Palestine. Big topics. You didn't come in lightly. You chose really, really big topics. I think I'll begin with the international media topic. Media studies is something that I've been interested in since the time of my master's degree. And with this particular issue, we can see that back in the 1990s, there was, for Western media that is, there was some, coverage of Islam and Muslims, and many listeners might recall that, back in the late 1980s, we had the Salman Rushdie affair, and we started to see, growing Muslim populations in Western countries. We of course had the US invasion of Iraq for the first time in 1991. And so this attracted a lot of media coverage of different parts of the Muslim world. And of course, we've had the ongoing so-called Israel-Palestine conflict, but really we're talking about Israel's occupation of Palestine. I'll get to that later on. So there has been somewhat, a substantial amount of coverage that concerns Islam and Muslims in the West, particularly in the Western media. But it was really after September 11, 2001, that we saw a much more intense focus on Islam and Muslims in the Western media. Now, it's important to note that some of the coverage prior to the turn of the century wasn't that negative. In a lot of Western popular culture at the time, Muslims were quite positively regarded. If one thinks about, for example, some American popular culture, particularly Black American culture, you have, many famous and admired people like, the group Public Enemy or Ice Cube, others like that. You had the director Spike Lee make the film about Malcolm X. And so actually there was a lot of, positive media sort of coverage about Muslim people that you could see. And of course, what we find though is that this representation shifted quite markedly. So in the late 20th century, we had quite positive representations. Muhammad Ali comes to mind, and others. But from September 11, 2001, we had quite an intense focus on Islam and Muslims within a particular frame. And the framing of Islam and Muslims was really, concerned with terrorism, conflict, violence, and to a further extent, crime and criminality. And so when we look at media coverage of any issue, we notice that media tend to operate according to particular news values, as they're called. So this means that media are choosing stories that they think are going to be of interest to their audiences. And oftentimes, what researchers found is that the stories that they find to be of most interest to audiences are those that involve conflict, that are controversial, that a coverage of crises and things like that. And so what we see after September 11 is this very intense focus following these news frames, particularly in terms of crisis, conflict, and crime, criminality, and so forth, terrorism especially. And so Muslims are constantly being framed or represented within these contexts. And so what we see is that when we look at data in terms of public opinion polls and things like that about, attitudes towards Islam and Muslims, we see them to be leaning more towards the negative side, but we see them decidedly negative in the few years immediately after 9/11. And most researchers will tell us that this is an outcome of very pejorative or negative media reporting about Islam and Muslims, particularly repeated coverage of Islam and Muslims in these frames of terrorism, conflict, etc. And this representation has continued for a number of decades now, and particularly with the so-called war on terror, we've seen continued intense coverage of Muslims within these frames. And this negativity has been, compounded over time. I suppose there's three basic theories within media studies that are quite important here. The first one would be, there's a perspective called agenda setting. And this is all about the media telling people what to think about. So agenda setting is all about the media from the many different events and issues and things going on in society and around the world. The media chooses certain events to focus on, thinking about those news values I mentioned, picking out those ones that they think are going to be of most interest to their audiences. And so agenda setting really meant that we were going to see quite a lot of coverage about Islam and Muslims, in this post-September 11 period. And so it was. There's another very important perspective here that I talk about in my book, Media Framing of the Muslim World, and that is framing. So if agenda setting is all about telling people what to think about, framing is telling people how to think about it. So framing is important because when we look at media frames, we think about and we analyze what is included within a particular news story and what is excluded from that story. What kind of images are included in that story? What kind of images are excluded? Who's interviewed in the story and who's left out of those interviews? And so what we see, if we look at the research that's been done on the coverage of Islam and Muslims over the past couple of decades, we can see that there is an overrepresentation of stories that relate to conflict and terrorism and that sort of thing. There is a lack of representation of the Muslim voice often in there. And also there's a lack of representation of experts on Islamic and Muslim issues. There's a fair bit of research also that says that journalists were caught a little bit off guard after September 11, in that there wasn't really a good amount of knowledge among journalists about Islam, Muslims, and different countries in the Muslim world. And so what we found was that there's a lot of stereotypical reporting and representation of Islam and Muslims in the media, including in the images that were used and in terms of the kinds of narratives and discourses and rhetoric that was used in relation to Muslims. Another very important finding in the research on the international media and its coverage of Islam and Muslims is that this coverage doesn't tend so much to talk about Islam, the religion. If you ran an analysis of news articles or news stories where the word Islam is mentioned in the headline or lead paragraph, if you were to look through those stories, often the story has actually nothing to do with the religion. It's not talking about, the basics of the faith, the worship of Allah, the following of our Prophet, peace be upon him, prayer, charity, fasting, those things that are, essential to our faith. Rather, the stories are much more focused on those things that are peripheral, conflict, violence, these sorts of things that oftentimes Muslims are the biggest victims of, rather than being the perpetrators. And so really what we're seeing here is it's really maybe the term Islamist political ideology is often used to describe these kinds of things. And so while the word Islam is often used, the story is often about some political, even ideological, or something to do with political conflict or violence. And so this also had quite a significant impact on the image and the representation of Islam in the media. And another point to note here is that for people, particularly in Western countries, the mass media was a primary source of information. One of the studies that we did in Australia found that about 80% of people relied on the mass media as their primary source of information about information concerning Islam and Muslims. And so if the media is portraying Islam and Muslims in a negative or pejorative way, it stands to reason that people are going to have, quite negative attitudes and views about Islam and Muslims. Here in Australia, where I come from, still to this day, we have between 40 and 50% of the Australian population expressing negative attitudes or views about Islam and Muslims. And the other issue that we have now, obviously, is social media, where we don't just have, news organizations that are, covering Islam in a negative way, but you have organized, groups that are.
Professor, if I may,
Sure.
before moving on to social media, may I please ask a couple of questions about the mainstream media? I mean,
Sure.
how is the situation in Australia different or the same when you compare it to continental Europe or to United States or Canada? Is it? I mean, is there a difference? Is there a better or worse situation at all? I mean, please excuse my ignorance. But
No,
how is
not
the
at all.
Australian, concept? Is it? I mean, is it along the same lines of the typical Western misrepresentation and ideology?
Well, I should have said, when we say Western media, not all media outlets are the same. You often have public media, like you've got the BBC in the UK or you've got the ABC here in Australia. They're often a lot more responsible in their coverage of a range of issues, including Islam and Muslims, although they have also been fixated on covering Islam and Muslims within the frames of conflict, violence, terrorism. But you've got other media, private commercial media that are, their business is profit. And one of the ways they maximize profit is by covering stories that they know are going to attract the attention of audiences. They're sensational, and often they're quite alarmist. You've heard of Rupert Murdoch. He's from Australia. He owns a lot of the media here. And
news as entertainment, right?
News Limited, yeah. News as entertainment somehow, yeah. So so you have, he has investments in the UK and in Europe and so on, in the United States as well. And so you get different types of media. You get some of those that are more responsible, like often the public, like the PBS in America or the BBC in the UK. The ABC here in Australia, but then you also get this commercial media that are operating because they're businesses. They operate for profit, and I think Noam Chomsky, made this point really, really well back in the 1980s, particularly with that book Manufacturing Consent that he wrote with Edward Herman. Excellent book that really, made clear this profit motive of mass media, and so you get different types of media, but overall, I think that journalists not having a very good understanding of Islam and Muslims, and that kind of normative discourse about Islam being the other, and your show is all about Orientalism. And Orientalism is really, if we look at Edward Said's discussion of Orientalism, particularly in his book covering Islam, it's all about contrasting the West, if you like, with the Muslim world. And so, the West is enlightened and it's democratic and it's supportive of human rights. And the Muslims are opposite of that. It's, authoritarian, it's violates human rights, and so on. So seeing the Muslim world as always fundamentally different, or the antithesis of what we think of the West as being, this is particularly problematic when it comes to the mass media. So Orientalism plays a very important role. So among these theories that we've discussed so far, we've spoken about, the news values, we've spoken about agenda setting, we've spoken about framing, and really Orientalism is another very important point to note when thinking about, the Western media. But of course, to be fair, not all media in the West is the same. Some of them, like the public-owned ones, are often more responsible than the purely commercial ones.
But one last question before moving on to social media. What do you think about the other recently newer establishments, news outlets such as Al Jazeera, which was found after 9/11, or we have TRT World here? Do you think that these are able to make any difference in terms of balancing out the discourse here?
I think they have.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think they have. So often, I follow TRT and Al Jazeera. And one of the things we noticed here in Australia was that certain news agencies, particularly the ABC, and we've got another one called SBS over here, which is the special broadcasting service. They do a lot of multicultural and world news type of thing. they often will, take their news from Al Jazeera, for example. And this has been very important for Australian media audiences because it's given them a different perspective, perhaps in many ways a more authentic perspective, because it's information is being presented by journalists who are there on the ground and who understand Muslim issues a lot better than, perhaps some of the correspondents who are maybe overseas, but perhaps a little bit isolated from, the places where these stories are happening, and perhaps a little bit not as well informed as they need to be on certain issues. But in saying that, to be fair, the ABC and other agencies here in Australia have had very good, foreign correspondents on Middle East. There's Sophie McNeil is one that comes to mind. Yalda Hakim before her is another one that comes to mind, who did an excellent job of covering stories in the Middle East and really bringing to light, issues that Australians didn't really have a good understanding of. But I think the presence of Al Jazeera has been important for, giving that more informed, a contextual and nuanced understanding of issues in the Muslim world. Yeah. So now, social media now is a new, beast to deal with. We've got, organizations that employ people specifically to push out, fake news, false information, misinformation, and Islamophobic information as well. Information designed to either feed on or raise people's fears about Islam and Muslims. And we also can look at some research that's been done, here in Australia, in Europe, and elsewhere, in the United States, and so on. That's looked at, what is it that far right groups or people who sit on the right are concerned about. There was one particular study by a scholar named Charles Miller done here in Australia in 2017, and he looked at right-wing groups in Australia, and he looked at their social media posts, and he was specifically interested in what they had to say about Islam and Muslims. And what he noticed was that their posts really say little or nothing about the religion of Islam. They're not particularly concerned about Muslims praying or fasting or giving charity or the basics of the religion. This didn't come into it. Rather, the concern of people who he classified as being part of these right-wing groups, or people that were members of these or supported these far right or right-wing Facebook groups, were ultimately concerned about security and issues concerning terrorism. So all of their posts really revolved around Islamist ideology, these kinds of things. Their fear was not of the religion of Islam, but of a politicized version of the religion. So I think there's a lesson in that for us as Muslim people to, I'm not saying Muslims are not entitled to their politics and all of that. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying that there's a confusion here, and there's a conflation of the religion and political ideologies that sometimes use the religion to try to mobilize people to press their cause forward and that sort of thing. And sometimes this is doing a disservice to the faith, and we're seeing people adopting very negative views of Islam and negative views of Muslims, and we've seen quite disgusting and offensive representations of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in various Western countries as well. So this has been a consequence of this politicization of the religion and people trying to use it for purposes that aren't, I think, purely grounded in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. But that's perhaps another issue. So, social media has been particularly challenging as far as the representation of Islam and Muslims goes. And here in Australia and other Western countries, we've continued to see quite high rates of negative attitudes towards Islam and Muslims. But when we look more closely at those attitudes, we can see that the fears and concerns of people are much more focused on political issues, political violence and that sort of thing, than they are anything to do with the religion itself. Okay, I might move on now to the topic of Islam, because we've kind of segued into, into that topic. Islamic studies is one of my passions. My grandfather was an imam. In fact, he was the first imam of the state in which I live, that's Queensland. In fact, we have the oldest mosque on the east coast of Australia, here in my hometown of Brisbane. And my grandfather was the imam of that mosque for 40 years. My family built that mosque, and and so we're very proud of our history. In fact, Muslims have been in Australia, Muslim communities have been in Australia since the 1800s. So we're very much part of the country, although many people would think about Muslims as being sort of a new, foreigners and that sort of thing. But, I'm fourth generation born in Australia, and, my family has, members that are now sixth generation from Australia. And there are similar stories in the UK and in other parts of Europe, of course, and of course in the United States as well. There was an interesting book done by an author by the name of Sally Howell. I think this was published in the early 2000s. It was called Old Islam in Detroit. And it was talking about those very early generations of Muslims that had come to the United States, that included the African Americans as well. So there's a long story of Islam in many Western countries that I think Westerners would do well to learn about. And I think that can help break down some of the stereotypes and misconceptions about Islam and Muslims in the West, at least. Now, when it comes to the topic of Islam, I think one of the issues that arises, particularly from the media coverage, is that the media tend to adopt a view of Islam that is often expressed by the minority of Muslims rather than the view that is representative of the majority of Muslims. I think there's a very important work that's going on in the field of Islamic studies that's looking at early Islam versus how the religion came to be formulated and constructed as it was written down in the hundreds of years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The work that I think is most important is that work that's looking at the Quran and the various principles and objectives that arise out of the Quran. The work on maqasid is particularly important. I'm also involved with some colleagues from Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar that are doing some very important work on documents referred to as the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad. So these are historic documents that are believed to have been written during the Prophet's lifetime. He authorized, his scribes, Imam Ali and Muawiyah being two of them, to write these agreements, or covenants is probably a better word, that he issued to Christian, Jewish, and other communities of his time. And these documents are fascinating. They concur with a particular verse in the Quran in Surah Al-Hajj, that verse 20, chapter 22, verse 40, that talks about the protection of, if Allah didn't check one set of people by means of another, they would be pulled down monasteries, churches, synagogues, and mosques in which the name of Allah is much invoked. So these covenants are about the Prophet saying to Christian, Jewish, and other communities, you have the right to practice your faith. And in fact, we will protect your places of worship, and we'll protect you as people, your property, etc. And so this seems to be a continuation of the constitution of Medina, where the Prophet organized relations within the city and regarded people within the city as part of one ummah. And of course, this included Muslims and non-Muslims. And so by extension, he also wanted to have these peaceful and positive relations with non-Muslim communities outside of Medina as well. So I find this research by Professor Ibrahim Zain and Ahmed Al-Wakil to be, particularly important. I would hope that non-Muslims would pay more attention to this, because there's a very important issue here when it comes to far right and right-wing extremism. If you look at the manifestos of people like Anders Breivik, who committed that terrorist act in Oslo in 2010 or 2011, I think it was 2011. He wrote a 1,500 plus page manifesto in which he regarded Islam as a you know, the history of Islam as a jihad against, you know, non-Muslims. And he was an inspiration for the Australian guy who did that terrorist attack in Christchurch in New Zealand in 2019. You know, this person killed 51 people at 2 mosques when they were, you know, performing Jummah prayer. In his manifesto, he talks about, you know, this great replacement, that non-Muslims are in danger of being exterminated or replaced by Muslim immigrants in particular. So we've got, and again, he's reiterating this idea that the history of Islam was a history of Muslims subjugating and persecuting and trying to eliminate, you know, people of other faiths. And this is absolutely inconsistent with the approach of the Prophet, peace be upon him. He, you know, I mean, the Quran clearly states, you know, lakum dinakum waliyadin, la akrahu fid din. There's no compulsion in religion, unto you, your way, unto me, mine. And these covenants and the Constitution of Medina clearly demonstrate the Prophet wanted to have peaceful coexistence with others. And the Quran repeatedly says that, you know, if Allah wanted everyone to believe the same way, they would have been created like that. The Quran is a book that offers people the ayatollah, the signs of Allah, and you need to use your, you know, your inner faith and your, you know, your rational thinking, your cognitive faculties to come to realization that, you know, there is one creator of all of this, and this is one creator that we should submit to. So everyone is entitled to believe what they want, but at the same time, we must treat each other respectfully. We should always work towards having peaceful relations with other people, and people shouldn't overstep the bounds though, and you know, mistreat others. I think this is the more kind of authentic position of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So this kind of research, I think, is very important for countering a lot of the far right, you know, rhetoric and misinformation that we get, not only from these, you know, manifestos and circulating among these groups, but is being pushed out, you know, through social media now. It's clearly a misrepresentation of the early teachings of Islam, and you know, it's contributing to, you know, a rise in far right extremism and terrorism that we're seeing in different Western countries, including here in Australia.
Professor, if I may, now before moving on to the question of Palestine and how it, you know, affects this discourse, the discussion and representation, for that matter, misrepresentation of Islam in the Western discourse, I would like to talk a couple of things that you had just mentioned. Your actual personal history in Australia, your family history, you know, seems very interesting. And there are actually scholarships, you know, on related fields, such as, for example, the emergence of Islam, you know, the first Muslims in the United States, the first Muslims in Europe, the history of Islam, the translation of the first Quran, for example, in Europe, in England. There are amazing studies, and this scholarship is very important to actually refute another myth. The myth is that Muslims are always shown as outsiders of Western civilization. You know, the myth that Islam is always seen as an afterthought. But a lot of people, a lot of, you know, popular culture are unfortunately unaware of the fact that had it not been, you know, for the contributions of Islam and Islamic civilization, you know, Muslim scientists, there will be no mathematics. You know, for example, had it not been for, you know, for Al-Khwarizmi, there will be no algorithms. You know, it's as simple as that in many branches of the sciences. You know, you know, one can think about Avicenna, you know, Ibn Sina, you know, the developments and contributions in sciences and medicine, you know, Baitul Hikmah, House of Wisdom in Baghdad, translation movements in Toledo. So, but a lot of people are unaware of the fact that there lies Islam behind what's called Renaissance, behind what's called Reform. Now, going back to your personal history in Australia, did you ever think about, you know, maybe also writing on these issues, studying, let's say, the first Muslims in Australia or the history of Islam in Australia? Are there people who have already done that? I mean, you have a very rich agenda, actually, but did you also think about doing this?
Yeah, actually, there's quite a good literature on the history of Islam and Muslims in Australia, but actually there are some gaps in the literature as well. Often when you read books about the history of Islam in Australia, you read about the Macassan fishermen who used to visit with the the indigenous Australians. So they would come in the 1600s and the 1700s, before Europeans came to Australia. They were visiting the native Australians, the indigenous Australians, particularly in the north of the country, in the north, the Northern Territory and northern Queensland, northern Western Australia, because they would come seasonally and they would do their fishing. They would interact with the indigenous communities of
Were they
Australia.
Arabs? Are you talking
No,
about
they weren't.
Arabs?
They were from Indonesia. They were from Indonesia.
Oh, Indonesia. Okay, I see. Wow,
Indonesians,
interesting.
yeah.
Interesting.
From Makassar, a particular part of Indonesia. So they would come and they would interact, and they had very good relations, actually. And some of the Aboriginals even went back to Indonesia with them. And there are communities today who are, who have descendants who are originally from Australia. They're originally Australian Aborigines. Yeah. So, we have this happening, which was a very positive interaction. And one of my good colleagues from Griffith University, Professor Regina Ganter, has written extensively on this interaction. Then you'll often read about the Afghan Camellias. After the British came and colonized the country, they wanted to explore the interior. And the best way to do that was through the use of camels. And so they brought, people from, India, what is today India, Pakistan, Baluchistan, these areas, Afghanistan, which is how they got the name, the Afghan Camellias. They brought them here with the camels. And this is how the interior of Australia was explored. This is how the overland railway was done, how the telegraph was done, and all of these kinds of. They were very instrumental in the exploration and the infrastructure that got built, across the the deserts of the inner parts of Australia, central Australia. So that's very. But the thing is that there were laws in Australia at the time that prevented the Camellias from bringing their families, and so often they would marry with Aboriginal women, or they didn't have families and so forth. And so really there wasn't any Muslim communities that were built around these Camellias that came here. So but at the same time, in the 1800s, and this is some research this is where I'm talking about the gap. The gap here is about the early Australian Muslims, other than the Camellias, who came, who settled. They were farmers, they were small business owners, fruit hawkers, this kind of thing. And these are the people who actually built the first Muslim communities and institutions in Australia. They built the first mosques, and they established the first Muslim organizations in Australia in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And so the Holland Park Mosque here in Brisbane, the oldest on the east coast of Australia, was built in 1908, very early on. You have another one built in Adelaide a little bit earlier than that, but on the east coast, this is the oldest one. And it was built by these early Muslims who came and settled at that time. They, of course, some of them brought their families, but many of them intermarried with local people. My great-great-great-grandfather, great-great-great-grandfather, he was from India. He married a lady who had migrated to Australia from England. And so you get about 4 or 5 different families: my family, the Rane family, the Goss family, the Khan family, and the Muhammad family, all coming from this union. And then you had some other migrants that came and intermarried with the children of those of that family. And so you get the settlement in Queensland of quite a large number of Muslim families, and you get the establishment of the Muslim community from that. So that's a little untold part of the history that needs probably a little bit more light shed on it. Yeah.
Sounds very interesting, Professor. Now, Professor, in the remainder of what's left in this webinar, could you please talk very briefly about how Israeli-Palestinian conflict affects dissemination of news, against Muslims and Islam, please? Yeah.
I mean, for so long, the Israel-Palestine conflict has largely been dominated by the Israeli discourse. The Israeli discourse is essentially that, that it leaves out the historic reality of what happened here, and the reality of the situation, which is that there is an illegal military occupation going on. Israel's military is illegally occupying Palestinian land. And I use the word illegal because that's the language used by the United Nations General Assembly and Security Council resolutions. So here we have a situation where the news media has covered quite extensively and for a long period of time, the Israel-Palestine conflict, as it's called in the news media, but always from the Israeli perspective. If you look at some studies that have been done, content analyses of the media coverage of the Israel-Palestine conflict, you can see that the word occupation is very seldom used. If you don't understand there's an occupation, you can't understand Palestinian resistance. And so you're left with the idea that there is these two sides that are just fighting with one another, squabbling over land or something like that. And you really have no sense of the history of the conflict. The history of the conflict is this, that this was land that was previously part of the Ottoman Empire. While it was part of the Ottoman Empire, it was mainly inhabited by, it was inhabited by Palestinians. Most of those were Muslim. A sizable minority of about maybe 20% were Christian, and a small minority were, maybe 3-4% were Jewish. In the early 1900s, you had migration of Jewish people from Europe fleeing, pogroms. And I think this is an important point to note. The anti-Semitism that Jewish people experienced in Europe is a reality. And it's part of the reason why some of them, many of them needed to flee. Some of them came to Palestine. The British defeated the Ottoman Empire and took over Palestine. And so from 1918, the British are basically occupying Palestine as a colonial power. They occupied many parts of the Middle East and the broader world. And they facilitated the migration of hundreds of thousands of Jewish people from Europe. The problem with that is that that also was responsible for the dispossession of the Palestinian people from their land and from livelihood. And so you had Palestinian resistance against this. The British crushed that resistance, but then that was in the 1930s. But by the 1940s, you have, the Zionist movement becoming quite, growing in strength and growing in, military capability as well. You had military and paramilitary forces. They set about engaging in what we would describe today as terrorism, what was described as at the time as terrorism, bombings, sabotage, assassinations, and so forth, including of UN officials. They blew up the King David Hotel, which was the headquarters of the British in Palestine, which resulted in the death of 92 people. And Britain basically washed its hands of Palestine and handed the problem of it over to the United Nations. So one of the reasons why the United Nations is so important here is that they have been responsible for, they've been responsible for trying to address this issue since the United Nations has essentially come into existence. And so when I look at the Israel-Palestine conflict, my perspective is that there is a solution here that's based on the Security Councils and the General Assembly resolutions. If we put the General Assembly resolutions aside for a moment and just focus on the Security Council resolutions, because ostensibly they have a heavier weight as far as international law is concerned, they have addressed all of the fundamental issues here about the right of return of refugees, about territory, about Jerusalem, about settlements. And these resolutions are very clear that the Palestinians have a right of return. The Palestinian refugees that have been driven from their homes and land have a right of return, because under international law, people have the right to return to their homes and land after war, conflict, and this sort of thing. Jerusalem, is not the rightful possession of the, of the state of Israel. That's not what the Security Council resolutions say. They say that this is an illegally occupied city, and that there needs to be a solution here that is agreeable to both sides. The settlements that have been built on Palestinian land are illegal, and as far as the territory in general is concerned, there is a fundamental point in international law, which is the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force. And of course, anyone who's looked at the history understands, including people that have looked at the Israeli military archives, people like Benny Morris, Avi Shleim, Ilan Pape, they've all pointed out in their various books that there was, there were massacres that took place. Half the Palestinian population was driven from their homes and land. You know, that dispossession is illegal under international law. So, I mean, what I'm saying is that I think we need to refer to international law when we're trying to understand and find a resolution to this conflict. You know, but we also need to be, you know, compassionate people. You know, I mean, this is completely unacceptable that a people must live in the way the Palestinians have had to for multiple generations now. For the people of Gaza to be in essentially what has been described as the world's largest open-air prison, to be controlled by air, land, and sea, and to be so vulnerable to be bombed, you know, at will by the Israeli military. For the Palestinians in the West Bank to be treated in the way they are, with the checkpoints and all of these other humiliating impositions that have impacted on their lives. You know, there is a fair solution to this. I think it's more along the lines of one state where every person in that land, you know, should have their basic rights. You know, we have a framework of international law. You know, we have a normative framework for a just peace, I would say.
Professor, thank you so much. Now, related with the last, you know, part about this issue, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one of the points that you have made, which I think very, very significant and relevant here, is that, you know, nobody in their right mind, you know, is denying, you know, anti-Semitism, you know, was a fact. You know, nobody denies that, you know, the Nazis or Hitler was a monster, you know. But the thing is that the irony here is that Palestinians become the victims of the victims. You know, that's the, you know, the sad tragedy here. You know, why are they supposed to, you know, pay the price for actually what the Europeans, you know, did to themselves? So that's I think, you know, oftentimes misunderstood and misrepresented, because oftentimes whenever you start talking about the rights of the Palestinians and there's tortures and atrocities, you know, done to the Palestinians, you know, there's this instant attempt in the mainstream media to try to label people as anti-Semitic, or, you know, nothing could be farther from the truth. You know, you know, we all recognize, you know, what happened in the Second World War, and you know, Hitler was a monster, and it was a genocide, pure and simple. But then trying to see what happened to the Palestinians, you know, from that perspective, it might be a little bit misleading. I think that's important.
Absolutely, it's important. Yeah. I think we have to appreciate, you know, there should be basic standards of human rights and international law that must be respected. To call someone an anti-Semite because they say the state of Israel should not be committing atrocities against the Palestinian people, it should not be imprisoning and torturing children, it should not be, you know, removing people from their homes in the middle of the night or, you know, early hours of the morning and taking them. These are all violations of the, you know, the Geneva Convention, these kinds of things. Yes. I mean, to say this is anti-Semitism, to call this out, would be akin to saying it's Islamophobic to criticize Saudi Arabia for the atrocities it's committed in Yemen. You know, we would openly say that what Saudi Arabia and UAE has done in Yemen is wrong, and they should never have. I mean, this is completely unacceptable in our religion. But we don't call it Islamophobia. We just say, we call it for what it is. It's, you know, it's just deplorable, you know, conduct of a state. You know, Tahir Abbas calls it in his book state terrorism, and, you know, makes the point that we need to have much more focus on, you know, this state terrorism. I think we also need to have much more focus on other forms of extremism. We talk a lot about so-called Islamist extremism or jihadist extremism, whichever. We talk about far-right extremism, but there's Zionist extremism here as well, like what the settlers are doing. I mean, Palestinians can't go out and, you know, harvest their crops without the fear of being, you know, killed or, you know, maimed and, you know, harassed by, you know, Israeli settlers. People in Hebron suffer on a daily basis from these, you know, extremist settlers. So there's an extremism among the Zionists as well that needs to be much more in focus, I think.
Exactly. Now, can we try to combine this last issue, Israel-Palestinian conflict, and the first issue that you have start talking about, international media, To what extent do you think it is actually exactly because of this? Is it because that international media outlets are controlled and manipulated by certain lobbyists against Palestine, or to what extent is it just religious hate or bigotry? To what extent is it just intolerance? But
Yeah.
what is the drive here, do you think, behind international media's reluctance to fairly represent Muslims? I mean, what's the reason behind this cultural talk? I think it was Mahmoud Mandani who called this, as culture talk about Islam. It has nothing to do with the real Islam, but it has all of these negative connotations with terrorism, with barbarism, with primitivism, so on and so forth. What do you think is the drive here? Is it the Israel-Palestinian conflict, or are there other components of it as well?
I mean, there are a lot of factors, but one of the things I would note is that it hasn't remained static. It's changed over time. If we look at public opinion, here in Australia, even in the United States, in Europe, public opinion on the Israel-Palestine conflict has changed, and it's decidedly moved towards identifying more with the Palestinian view of this issue. The Israeli narrative of this conflict, that we're fighting against terrorists, doesn't hold up for the majority of people anymore. Most people, certainly here in Australia, recognise that the Palestinians' rights have been violated. They're suffering under an occupation. The majority of people are aware of that, and the majority of Australians would say there should be right of return of refugees, there should be an end to these settlements, and there should be a fair kind of sharing of the city of Jerusalem. The media has also shifted a little bit. You do get a bit more, I would say, balanced coverage of the conflict now, whereas before it was covered more along the lines of tit-for-tat violence, and it was often flipped. So you'd hear about Israel retaliating against the Palestinian attack. You didn't hear that the first thing was because of the Israeli occupation, or settlers killed Palestinian people, or something like, or soldiers just shot a Palestinian and there's been no recourse and no justice for that. Now you're hearing a little bit more about the reality of the situation. People are more aware there's an illegal occupation. They're more aware of the brutality of the Israeli forces. They're more aware of the atrocities committed against Palestinian people, including the violations of human rights, Palestinian children being in prison. Ahad Tamimi, I think, has done a lot to raise awareness of the suffering of Palestinian children. Israel's repeated bombing of Gaza, probably on an annual basis, I suppose, makes international headlines, and people look at that and say, that is wrong. People may not have an in-depth understanding of the Israel-Palestine conflict, but they can see that there is something very wrong here. And I don't think that the Israeli government has the sympathies of Western people in general, certainly not of Australians. I think most people are aware this is a fairly right-wing government, but in reality, its origins are from Zionist extremism, but it's a fairly right-wing government, and people are, I think, largely aware of that. It's really the politicians where the movement hasn't gone far enough, and I think this is the problem. This is the problem here in Australia, in the United States, in Europe and elsewhere. Politicians seem to be stuck in this situation where they're incapable of calling out Israeli violations of human rights and international law, I think, as you say, for fear of being labelled an anti-Semite. Whereas they don't have those same fears when it comes to calling out, other countries for violations. I think that there shouldn't be any exception about Israel. We acknowledge there is anti-Semitism, we acknowledge it's a problem, but there's also anti-Islam and anti-Muslim sentiments that are a problem as well. All of those things need to be addressed, but I think what politicians need to do is have the courage to call out countries like UAE and Saudi Arabia for the human rights violations and the atrocities that were committed in Yemen. They need to call out Israel for the atrocities committed and the human rights violations and the violations of international law committed against the Palestinians. And same for Myanmar and, Kashmir and other places where these sorts of things are happening. But I mean, I think unfortunately, we've got, we haven't got good leaders at the moment, and maybe that's a reflection on us. But
It's
you know,
all great points. All great points, Professor. Thank you so much. Now, one of the questions that we have is about this social media. People, very invested in the social media in terms of its possibilities for alternative discourses, for creating alternative narratives around these issues. Do you think that the social media is able to do that, or is it already, co-opted, by certain, mainstream, companies or corporations? Do you think that it has the power and potential to, once again, outbalance, these prejudices and stereotypes against Islam and Muslims?
I think they have the capability. Some of the information that's come out recently from the whistleblowers is that the reason why they've been reluctant to pull back on some of that, that negative, that misinformation and that sort of thing, is because they know that the negativity is what will drive people to engage with the platforms more. And so there's more money to be made because there's more, advertising revenue to be generated. So they have the capability of putting out correct information and removing misinformation, but they choose not to because they're motivated by profit. So it's a similar situation we've had with the traditional mass media. They will engage in sensational and alarmist reporting because it's more profitable to do that. The social media organizations are equally irresponsible and engaging in the same, they have the same profit motivations. But, this is the problem with, people generally and big corporations in particular. We had a situation here in Australia where one of the mining companies, Rio Tinto, completely razed to the ground a sacred Aboriginal site. This was a site that was, in a particular part of Australia, a remote part of Australia, but it was a sacred area for the Indigenous people, and it contained a large amount of what we call rock art. So these are, ancient paintings that tell us a lot about the history of the Indigenous people of this country. They razed that to the ground. The reports say that they knew what they were doing because they sought legal advice to say, well, what's going to happen if, they knew they were doing something wrong, but they did it and they got away with it. Again, it's the profit motive that comes before people, profit before people. And I think that, if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that we do need cultural change. And a big part of that cultural change, I think, has got to be, we've got to put people before profits. I said before, we don't have good leaders, but some places do have good leaders, like New Zealand, for example. Jacinda Ardern is an excellent leader of that country. Finland and some of the other Scandinavian countries have good leaders as well. New Zealand did something quite remarkable where they, instead of their budget being based around how much profit is generated and so on, they're focusing much more on welfare. And so the measure of success is not about how much profit is generated, but what is the well-being of the people. And I think we need to alter our thinking like that. And our religion, Islam, lends itself for us to think in that way. I mean, if we look at what is stated in the Quran about riba and exploitation and these sorts of things, greed, the point we should take away is that we should not be greedy, and we should be very careful about being obsessed with gaining lots of wealth. We should be much more focused on being, every verse of the Quran, every chapter of the Quran, Allah chooses the names Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, which to introduce that chapter to us. We should be compassionate and merciful. We should be kind and caring. We should be just and fair. These are the principles of our religion. I mentioned the concept of maqasid earlier. These are the principles of the faith. We shouldn't be operating according to how much profit we make. We should be operating according to how much well-being is there for people. And a country like New Zealand, is actively working in that direction. And I hope others would, follow their example. Australia is going to be far behind because we're always slow, but that's our hope. That's our hope. Yeah.
What they say in media: if it bleeds, it leads. Right. That's the mentality in Hollywood. That's the mentality in unfortunately in all the mainstream media. and this concept of people before profit. I think that's a very, very important one. Professor, it was a very, very informative, eye-opening talk. Thank you so much. I'm going to have one last question before we end, but let me just summarize some of the key points that you mentioned. I've particularly found, your theorization of media studies and misrepresentation of Islam around the concepts and keywords such as media framing, agenda setting. I think these are very, very, helpful and useful keywords to theorize, and expand the scholarship in these areas. It is also, great to hear that our own TRT world is also making a, difference, in this regard. People from Australia are also watching it. It's just, great to learn about and hear about. Now, one last question. What do you suggest? I'm trying to ask this question to each one of our speakers to inspire, especially newly emerging scholars. What is your advice for the new, fresh scholars, MA students, PhD students, or people who have just finished their PhDs, who are starting to work on these issues? What do you think they should, pay much more attention on? What are some of the subjects and issues that you think are more, important, I don't know, than others in terms of methodology, in terms of subject matter? What would you suggest to these, fresh minds?
I mean, it's different for different fields. Different fields are at a different place of their evolution and their development. But I think for Islamic studies and Muslim studies, for example, I think a critical, analytical, evidence-based approach is very important. There are discourses about Islam that circulate among, the media, the social media, the right wing and the far right, that are really much more representative of what we might call imperial Islam. The Islam, well, it's called Islam, but it's really Muslim empires. And empires operate, we're talking about prophets before, people, but empires operate because they want more territory, they want to be able to collect more taxes and this sort of thing. I'm not saying that empires didn't do good things. Of course, they did good things as well, but we can't assume that everything an empire does is necessarily consistent with the principles of the faith. Because to follow the principles of the faith is a lofty undertaking, and a state doesn't always have the capacity, the means, and the ruh, the soul to do something like that, right? But if we look at the religion in its earliest phase, in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, when we look at the Quran in terms of the principles it's trying to convey, we come out with a different picture, and we're left with a message that talks about compassion and mercy, kindness, fairness. We just open up the Quran, look at Surah Al-Baqarah, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْغَيْبِ وَيُقِيمُونَ الصَّلَاةَ وَمِمَّا رَزَقْنَهُمْ يُنْفِقُونَ. Make your prayers. We're not on this earth to just profit, take, and exploit. This is why we got the environmental problem we got. This is why we've got, a bunch of other problems that we're dealing with, because we think we can just continue to exploit. We're here for a purpose, and there's an afterlife here. Beyond this, our relationship with other people should be based on concern and care for their well-being. Give out of what we have to other people. Making profits is not what we're supposed to be doing here. Our best purpose should be to try to make life as comfortable and as fair to other people. So I think researchers maybe need to think about issues that are of higher purpose. Sometimes we get fixated on small details that really have no larger benefit. Thinking about issues that can benefit people, thinking about people's welfare and well-being, I think is a very important focus for these times.
Professors, thank you so much. I'm amazed by how well versed you're also in the Quran. I think you're also Hafiz.
I'm not a Hafiz of Quran.
You're not? Okay. Oh, okay.
But I did study at the International Islamic University of Malaysia. I did my undergraduate degree there. Of course, I learned from my grandfather as well. Yeah.
Well, the one thing very striking actually in your career is that you're not only a very prolific scholar, but also you have these awards in teaching. It doesn't, you don't see that quite often. Scholars are either too much specialized in their research and famous for their research, or they're great teachers. But it seems like you have been able to combine the two, both in teaching and you're interested both in teaching, increasing the quality of teaching, and also you've great research. That's also something I just wanted to congratulate you on.
Thank you. It's very nice for you to say. In fact, I mean, it kind of forced upon me, because the contract I was given when I was given a position at Griffith University was 40-40-20, 40% teaching, 40% research, and 20% service. And I must correct one thing, is that I'm no longer the director of the Griffith Centre for Social and Cultural Research.
Okay.
I did that job for a year while the director was on higher duty, so I was actually acting in that role. She's now back in that position, and I'm just a regular member of the centre. But yeah.
Thank you for the correction. And just I would like to conclude with this: your emphasis on people before profit. And you have talked about riba. That is, for our audiences, maybe we need to explain that it's interest rate, right? And faiz in Turkish, interest rate in English. And actually, there's a big fight in Turkey about this. But there, the thing is that the statico is just, the establishment is just too strong, and these are important challenges, which are nonetheless need to be undertaken. So also thank you for that emphasis.
Sure.
Professor, thank you so much overall. If there's one last thing you would like to add, you can do so. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time, for this very, very informative talk. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.